Alan Donovan for the Lekwaltak Treaty Society. I'm going to surgically divide my 12.5 minutes into 4 portions that dealing with highlighting 4 of the 6 written submissions, recommendations from the Lekwaltak Treaty Society, and then tag off to Mr. Kelleher, who will speak in the remaining 12.5 minutes on the issues in the written submissions raised by the coalition partner, AAA. The first submission that's critical to our clients, the first recommendation that we have is right at the top of page 2 of the written recommendations. And it's an overarching one that the Commission recommend that Canada ensure that policy reforms don't negatively impact coastal First Nations access to and participation in the Fraser River fishery. Now, our clients are coastal First Nations who fish primarily in the areas of Johnstone Strait and the interstices between the islands. This is salt water, but it's basically like a river system where fish are concentrated as they split at the top of Vancouver Island, many of them heading down through Johnstone Straits. It's a natural area for First Nations fishing, and the Lekwaltak people and indeed many First Nations along the coast rely heavily on the Fraser River sockeye. And it's an ancient reliance that continues today. We flagged on pages 3 and 4 of our written submissions some of the evidence that you heard in documents that were entered, documents being archival Government of Canada documents, that underline that this reliance on the fishery for livelihood purposes has been one of antiquity, that at the time reserves were set apart for our clients and for other coastal First Nations. It was acknowledged that these were small, often described as worthless or barren pieces of land that would only be suitable for reserves because the First Nations would continue to earn their living from the sea. The documents underline that our clients in particular, but other coastal First Nations, were toilers of the sea because they would never be toilers of the land, as the government official put it. The reserve commissioners were told to not interfere with the livelihoods and avocations of our clients, and in order to fulfill that requirement, they set apart very small reserves that were meant to be bases for continued fishing for livelihood and, of course, for food and other purposes. Now, this continued the economic dependence of the coastal First Nations on the livelihood fishery and on fishery for food, social, and ceremonial purposes. And it's a dependence and a reliance that continues to this day, although it has been damaged and undercut in the past by ill-advised licensing policy reforms that pushed in the 60s and 70s a large number of commercial Aboriginal fishers out of the industry. I should say at this point that the Supreme Court of Canada issued its decision in Lac aux Lambs this morning with profound disregard for the fact that I'd be making my oral submissions. But that decision, in very brief, dismissed the Lac aux Lambs appeal and held that they hadn't, as the courts below had held, on the particular facts of that case, they hadn't made out a commercial right to fish. It also commented on the reserve creation argument made by Lac aux Lambs, and on their facts it was found that the reserve creation didn't give rise to a fiduciary obligation on the Crown to grant special rights. It's an important case. It's been referred to, and it's a short case, but you'll have to read it to see where it takes you. But our submission on it is that it doesn't in any way undermine the history and the compelling facts that flow from the very small reserve allotment on the coast and the intention that First Nations living there would indeed continue to make their livelihood from the sea. They can, they have, and they don't have any other large land resources to turn to, leaving aside the much bigger unresolved question of Aboriginal title to the land itself. So our arguments remain as they have been, that it was always intended that these people would continue their livelihood from commercial fishing. And in fact, they have, despite the policy reforms that pushed many of them out of the industry. Our clients have continued to persevere and in many ways excel at commercial fishing. A lot of that evidence is laid out at pages 4 and 5 of our written submissions. Despite the odds, they've managed to hold on to their involvement in commercial fishing, which is profoundly important to them as a people, and turns as a linchpin on access and continued access to Fraser River sockeye. We note at page 5 that the continuation of access to Fraser River sockeye for commercial purposes for our clients and for other Aboriginal people on the coast is vital, first in terms of the connection to their culture. And this is a critical way that young Aboriginal people from these communities get out on the land, get out on the water, and involve themselves in the traditional livelihood of their parents and their grandparents going back untold generations. It's a way to transmit traditional knowledge, and it's also fundamentally connected to the food, social, and ceremonial fishery, because the coastal experience has been that those communities that have continued access to commercial fishing are able to use that capacity to address food, social, and ceremonial needs. And you sever one of those, you sever both. The other point, carrying over it onto page 6, is that this is a fundamental question of survival of Aboriginal communities up and down the coast. They rely on this, as Ms. Gardner correctly pointed out in her submissions this morning. Economic development is fundamental, and economic opportunities are fundamental to Aboriginal nations. Without access to resources and to a way of life that can sustain these communities, the communities will fail, and untold damage will be done to their culture and to their very people. So on page 6, we noted that Mr. McNacham's evidence, where he pointed out that it's critical that these communities remain in the industry, and he explained that legitimately these communities want to continue to make a living in their territory. And Mr. Duncan quoted as saying that many remote communities on the coast, you just can't pick up and go away. A reserve is a reserve. You have nowhere else to go. Fishing has been a mainstay for many, many years. And other compelling comments along the same lines on the same page. So our submission is that government policies have gone badly wrong for the coastal First Nations in the past, when they were forced out of the industry to some degree by the Davis and Mifflin plans. We want this commission, we ask that this commission make an overarching recommendation that whatever DFO in Canada does, they don't make things worse for these people, and they don't in any way impede their access to the Fraser River sockeye. Now, on page 8 and 9, we make some brief comments on co-management. It's certainly an interest of First Nations, as Ms. Gardner has explained and others have set out. Our only comment on that would be, we hope the obvious one, that there is an enormous diversity in interests and locations and goals and aspirations between First Nations. Anyone who talks about the Aboriginal perspective should probably be saying an Aboriginal perspective, or the Aboriginal perspective as they understand it. But there are many Aboriginal perspectives, and the perspectives of the coastal First Nations in their involvement in the Fraser River sockeye are going to be different from those who are differently situated, those who have treaty rights versus those who have Aboriginal rights, those who have a long history involved in the commercial industry, and those who have no such history. And based on location and migration routes, it's no failing to have a diversity of interest. It is a failing to assume that there should be one Aboriginal perspective, and that there can be some magic organization where you put two parties or two groups, a DFO and an Aboriginal group in a room, and everything will be worked out. And no one's suggesting that. Well, what we do suggest positively is that this commission recommend that increased capacity be provided, financial capacity for sub-regional Aboriginal groups. And we give the example on page 10 of the Atligay group in the Fisheries Society in the Lekwitok territory. And this is a group that's been making real strides on the ground in science and in monitoring and reporting. And we say in our submission that it's through groups like this that issues of authority and technical scientific capacity can be built from the ground up. So we'd have a foundation for real joint management or real co-management. On page 11 and following, we make some comments on the terminal fishery. And this is a huge concern to our clients, and we know it's a concern to other parties like the Coast Salish who've intervened in these proceedings. The concern is based on a number of factors that are set out at page 11. The first one is we're looking at a profound devaluation of the resource. The study that was entered through Mr. Morley indicated that you'd be looking at evaluation of upriver caught fish in the range of 23 to 36 cents a pound versus $1.60 to $2.30 for fish in the marine area. So a five-fold or a one-fifth valuation. And he makes the further point that because of mortality and attrition going upstream, you'd effectively have to allow two fish to escape the marine environment to get one up to be captured in the terminal fishery. So another 50% discount or devaluation. Now, this evidence was put in, it wasn't challenged on cross-examination. It seems to be the only evidence of a profoundly important point. We're looking at a 10-fold devaluation of the value of this resource. So a literal decimation of the industry. Even if the figures are somewhat off, a huge discount of the value of the resource. So why should this option even be considered? Well, an argument, the argument turns on weaker stocks. And in paragraph B of page 11, we set out a number of more moderate, reasonable tools that have been identified for protecting vulnerable stocks. And so it's like the American soldier officer said after the Battle of Bentray, we had to destroy the village in order to save it. Mr. Commissioner, you don't have to recommend the destruction of this industry in order to save it, or the destruction of the value of this fishery. There are more moderate, more surgical tools to get the same result. Outside of the value and sustainability, there's the socio-economic impact. That shifting the resource capture from the marine to the terminal area will affect the livelihood of communities, Aboriginal communities like the ones we represent on the coast. And Ms. Gardner, in her reply submission, addresses this issue by saying that, to be clear, the FNC is not recommending the pursuit of the commercial terminal and near-terminal fisheries at the expense of coastal First Nations. Those are comforting words, Mr. Commissioner, but in our submission, they can't change the fact that without the aid of very advanced quantum physics, you can't harvest the same fish in two different locations. If we were to move a large share of the fishery away from the ocean interception areas where it currently goes on into the upriver, you are going to remove the ability of our clients to continue sustaining themselves and their community, not only through food, social, and ceremonial fisheries, but through the commercial fisheries that they have been engaged in and will continue to engage in. There is only one set of fish. My daughter, when she was very little, used to think there was a difference between live chickens that you saw at the farm and meat chickens, as she called them, that you see at the store. And we didn't have the heart to tell her that's the same chicken. This is the same fish. And if you shift a huge level or a significant level of harvest away from the marine areas, you are creating very significant socioeconomic impacts on the people who can least afford it, people who have been dependent on this resource, and have the profound goal of continuing that relationship with this industry and this way of life that supported them when so many other changes, negative changes, have affected communities up and down the coast. The final comment, much less controversial, is that the expanded coastal test fishing should be endorsed and should be well funded and secured. This is one of the means of getting the proper science about how many fish are coming, their species division and their timing, to better enable DFO and managers to make proper decisions about how to allocate between sectors, to cut out the small levels of funding that are there for that type of management. Make no sense at all, and it makes eminent sense to instead support that gathering of knowledge and better manage the fishery in that regard. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Points, Mr. Commissioner, that the Aboriginal Aquaculture Association wish to leave with you are that the recommendations that First Nations, as I have mentioned, be given priority by way of accommodation in the issuance of new licenses, that consultation reflect their interests in this industry, that DFO, the Department of Fisheries, enter into a co-management scheme with the First Nations and including the Aboriginal Aquaculture Association, which would include an integration of the Aboriginal Aquaculture Association's certification program. And finally, and most importantly, and a bit repetitively, that the priority be given to independent research into the implications of aquaculture on the wild stocks, because as has been a continuing thread throughout this proceeding, there isn't any stakeholder who doesn't see the survival of the wild stocks as the ultimate priority. Thank you, Mr. Commissioner.
Ming Song, Counsel for Heiltsuk Tribal Council. I have with me my co-counsels Lisa Fong and Benjamin Ralston. We have in the audience today Chief Counsellor Marilyn Slett of the Heiltsuk Tribal Council, Hereditary Chief Mr. Harvey Humpchit Sr., and Kathy Brown, Community Member. We have the honor of being the last participants of this hearing. Being the last participants, you have already heard and received a multitude of both oral and written submissions and replies, and we will not, or try our best, not to duplicate them. We are going to focus on 3 discrete issues. My submission will cover in very, very broad strokes the Aboriginal right to fish and consultation. Mr. Ralston will cover the issues of joint management and aquaculture. Ms. Fong will cover FSC fishery and closing remarks. Their submissions will provide more detail and further substantive arguments within the context of Aboriginal rights to fish and consultation. Mr. Justice Binney in the Mikisew decision said, The fundamental objective of the modern law of Aboriginal and treaty rights is the reconciliation of Aboriginal peoples and non-Aboriginal peoples and their respective claims, interests, and ambitions. The management of these relationships takes place in the shadow of a long history of grievances and misunderstanding. The multitude of smaller grievances created by the indifference of some government officials to Aboriginal people's concerns and the lack of respect inherent in that indifference has been as destructive of the process of reconciliation as some of the larger and more explosive controversies. This quote accurately reflects my client's everyday reality in dealing with government. Yet despite this, no matter how devastating, challenging, and at times very discouraging, what seems to be a continuous uphill battle for my clients that they face, the issues regarding their Aboriginal rights are important to them, and the Heiltsuk are not going away. Mr. Harvey Humpchett Sr. has asked us to share with you how important the sockeye salmon is to him and to the Heiltsuk. Sockeye salmon, like many of our natural sea resources, is very important to the Heiltsuk. We are known as the ocean-going people, or the salmon people. I have seen the abundance of the sockeye in the 1960s, where there were millions and millions of returning spawners reduced to just a handful of salmon. I have witnessed the flourishing salmon industry going from thriving communities to ghost towns. We are concerned that the loss of the sockeye salmon will change the way of life for the Heiltsuk. When I was a little boy growing up in Namu, I would go fishing with my dad and never thought there would be a day when we would have to worry about the salmon. Today you look at the mighty Fraser and wonder, what ever happened? How did we get to the state we are in, and how much more can we do to the sockeye? What about our grandchildren, and what will they have if we lose our salmon? We have always been taught that we need to take care of our natural resource, and by doing that, nature will provide for you. The loss of the sockeye salmon completely changes the Heiltsuk way of life, and we have seen this with other sea resources that we used to depend on. We need to protect our salmon. The Heiltsuk also asked us to remind the Commission of why they are here, why they have chosen to travel from Bella Bella to be here today, why they chose to participate in this Commission. They believe the Commission can truly make a difference. They believe this is an opportunity for positive and real change. They hope that you, Mr. Commissioner, will have really listened to their concerns and will truly consider these concerns in making your recommendations. Lastly, the recommendations that you make will have either a direct positive or negative impact on the quality of their lives. Throughout this hearing and in closing submissions, we have heard statements, or there have been suggestions, that First Nations are and should be treated as mere stakeholders, and all stakeholders should be treated the same. So there is no misunderstanding, I wish to set the record straight once and for all. This is not about the inability to fish for recreation or employment. This is about cultural survival. This is about preserving an activity that is integral to the Heiltsuk people, and I wish to emphasize the word integral as that word is used to define Aboriginal rights pursuant to Vanderpeet. Heiltsuk and other First Nations before this Commission are not mere stakeholders. They are a third level of government. They have constitutionally recognized Aboriginal rights, which includes the right to fish. No other stakeholder possesses such status or recognition. The Supreme Court of Canada decisions in Gladstone and Sparrow provide a clear and comprehensive guide to priority and allocation of the fishery. According to these decisions, government must demonstrate that its actions are consistent with the government fiduciary duty towards Aboriginal people. This means the correct order of priority in the fishery is as follows: conservation, Indian fishing, non-Indian commercial fishing, non-Indian sports fishing. End of story. Canada and BC are urging this Commission not to make a ruling of the scope and nature of Aboriginal or treaty rights to fish. In particular, BC stated that you should not make any recommendations based on Aboriginal rights and title, given the nature of this forum and the evidence from witnesses chosen by Commission Counsel. If that is the case then, Mr. Commissioner, why is the Heiltsuk here? Why were we given participant status? We are not asking the Commission to make new law. We are asking you, Mr. Commissioner, in drafting your recommendations, to recognize, acknowledge, and consider that First Nations who stand before you have constitutionally protected rights to fish. Anything less diminishes the credibility and integrity of this Commission. Canada has also suggested that we have inaccurately interpreted the law as it relates to the Crown's fiduciary duty. At paragraph 276 of its reply submissions, it points out that we forgot to include the last sentence of a quote from Delgamuukw regarding the priority of Aboriginal interests. This sentence is, I quote, "However, the fiduciary duty does not demand that Aboriginal rights always be given priority," end of quote. In response, we say that although Aboriginal rights in general may not always be given priority, Sparrow and Gladstone clearly set out the priority of allocation as it relates to fishing to Aboriginal peoples. With respect to the issue of consultation and accommodation, we say the following. Within First Nations constitutionally protected Aboriginal rights is the right to be properly and duly consulted and accommodated. Canada appears to have three broad replies which suggest they have satisfied this duty. First is Canada's consultation policy as set out in its submissions starting at paragraph 489. This policy is made up of several documents. At paragraph 490, it says in 2004, DFO produced its consultation framework for fisheries and oceans Canada, which sets out 9 principles. At paragraph 491, it states that in 2006, DFO prepared another consultation guidance document entitled Consultation with First Nations Best Practices, a Living Document. This entailed a 6-stage process. At paragraph 492, it states that in March 2011, Canada released Aboriginal consultations and accommodation updated guidelines to federal officials to fulfill the duty to consult. This entailed 4 phases, and within those phases, various steps. What these policies, best practices, and guidelines fail to tell us, what Canada has failed to show us, is whether these documents were the product of consultation, whether these documents were disclosed to First Nations in their development. In fact, we have been told during this commission that there are certain policies regarding consultation that are not disclosed to First Nations. This failure to disclose, in our view, does not satisfy the Crown's duty to consult. Canada's second broad reply to consultation begins at paragraph 493 of its written submissions, that it has consulted with First Nations through extensive meetings and emails. In response, we say, quantity does not equal quality, process does not equal substance, and in so doing, quantity and process does not equal meaningful consultation. It is well-established law, as we set out in paragraph 97 of our written submissions, that the Crown's obligation to reasonably consult is not fulfilled simply by providing a process within which to exchange and discuss information. Meaningful consultation requires more than attending numerous meetings and drafting emails. In considering whether consultation has been meaningful, the courts have looked to the ultimate result and the rationale. Canada's third broad reply to consultation is found at paragraphs 504 and 509 of its submissions regarding policy development. The duty to consult has been met, they say, by drafting vast numbers of documents. Again, these actions in and of themselves do not meet the test of consultation. Throwing a maze of policies, frameworks, vision statements, and a myriad of other documents at First Nations does not meet the duty of consultation, nor is it good enough to tuck away hundreds of these documents on a website, in a library, or other public place. And Ms. Fong will provide more details on that matter. Were First Nations involved in the drafting of these documents? If so, to what extent was their involvement? What information, if any, was provided to First Nations? It is established law that the duty to consult requires consultation at the strategic policy level. As Rio Tinto said, government action is not confined to decisions or conduct which have an immediate impact on lands and resources. A potential for adverse impact suffices. Thus, the duty to consult extends to, quote, strategic higher levels, unquote, that may have an impact on Aboriginal claims and rights. During this commission, we have seen documents disclosed by DFO, which are policies used to manage fisheries. We have heard evidence of existing policies and policies to be created that will affect Aboriginal fishing rights. Yet various First Nations have testified they have not seen some of these documents, and it is unlikely First Nations will ever see these documents. As a result, in the end, the quote which I began my submissions with from Mikisew, "The shadow of a long history of grievances and misunderstandings continues. If government continues to act in a manner that, in Helsig's view, ignores their obligations to First Nations, is not made to change the way they deal with First Nations or to account for its actions, the objective of reconciliation will continue to remain elusive." Mr. Commissioner, your journey continues. I will simply leave you with Mr. Humpshit Sr.'s last words. We need to protect our salmon. Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. I will now turn the microphone over to Mr. Ralston.
Benjamin Ralston for Helsing Tribal Council. Now, my co-counsel Ming Song began these submissions with a reference to the long history of grievances and misunderstanding that characterizes the relationship between First Nations and Canadian governmental entities such as DFO. This is the context in which reconciliation must take place between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal peoples. I'd like to now turn to a subject with which we have all become quite familiar over the last year and a half. That's joint management. And I'd like to pose this as one potential way forward towards a goal of reconciliation. We've made extensive written submissions on this topic. At this time, I'll simply draw your attention to our key recommendations. I wish to first highlight key elements as to what is necessary for joint management between First Nations and DFO to be successful. Then, I'll expand upon the benefits that true joint management can hold for our fisheries. Also, with respect to terminology, you'll note that I refer to joint management in these submissions. Now, co-management is a term that's been espoused by DFO to describe what we see as moderate levels of First Nations involvement in fisheries management. Our clients, however, prefer the term joint management. This more accurately reflects a model in which First Nations govern the fisheries alongside representatives of the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. First of all, we recommend that Aboriginal rights and title be recognized by DFO as a prerequisite to true joint management. First Nations are rights and title holders. This is uncontroversial. As canvassed by Ms. Song, the case law has shown that Aboriginal rights may include access to fisheries for food, social, and ceremonial purposes, as well as economic access. In our submission, for First Nations to be able to effectively exercise these rights, there must also be an implicit jurisdiction for them to manage their fisheries. However, this is not a question we can rightfully put to you to decide. What is clear in the jurisprudence on Aboriginal rights and title is that DFO has a duty to consult with First Nations as rights and title holders. Furthermore, First Nations status as such gives rise to the fiduciary relationship between them and DFO. Because Aboriginal rights and title are constitutionally protected, DFO must take care not to occasion their infringement. It is for these very reasons that DFO is interested in pursuing a shared management structure with First Nations. DFO has testified that it seeks to ease its current burden of consultations through a shared management structure. Nevertheless, they consistently refuse to acknowledge the Aboriginal rights and title that give rise to the duty to consult that they bear. This is clearly unworkable on its face. Likewise, in their final submissions, Canada states that the sine qua non of any co-management structure is that it set out clearly defined roles, mandates, and responsibilities for each of the parties. What Canada fails to address in this submission, however, is how First Nations roles, mandates, and responsibilities in a joint management structure can be clearly defined without recognition of the rights and title upon which these inevitably must be based. As set out in the passage Ms. Song quoted from the Mikisew decision, reconciliation is the overall objective for the jurisprudence on Aboriginal and treaty rights. Reconciliation is also the goal of the treaty process. Joint management, likewise, has an important role to play in this process of reconciliation. Yet for reconciliation to take place, it will be necessary to address head-on what is being reconciled. Reconciliation requires that Aboriginal rights and title be given full and meaningful effect within the context of DFO's mandate to administer the salmon fishery. We also recommend that DFO treat First Nations as resource owners and not users in a joint management structure. This means First Nations must have 50-50 representation alongside the Crown. In the evidence before this Commission, various models have been proposed for a joint management structure. For example, extensive submissions have been made on the fisheries management regime in the state of Washington that came as a result of the historic Volt decision. Witnesses and participants' counsel have likewise made reference to the Archipelago Management Board established under the Guayhanas Marine Agreement between the Crown and the Haida Nation. Healthsick witness Ross Wilson also had the opportunity to testify to his own experiences with successful joint management structures. In particular, he gave evidence with regards to the steering committee of the Pacific North Coast Integrated Management Area, known as PNCIMA, and the management board of the Hakailuhalis Conservancy Area within Healthsick Traditional Territory. Healthsick endorsed all 4 of these models as worthy of your review, as well as DFO's. Implementing an appropriate collaborative management structure for British Columbia's fisheries will not be as simple as importing one of these structures wholesale. However, there's a commonality between all these models that we put forward as a necessary element for any successful joint management structure. First Nations are given equal representation alongside non-Aboriginal government representatives. Furthermore, First Nations are treated as resource owners and not users. In reply, Canada has taken issue with our submissions on the PNCIMA governance model. Canada suggests that we mischaracterize this model as treating First Nations as owners rather than users. Canada reminds us that the Memorandum of Understanding underlying PNCIMA, quote, does not alter the existing governance authorities or jurisdiction of the parties, end quotes. We agree that the PNCIMA process does not expressly declare First Nations are owners of fisheries resources. However, by recognizing First Nations' right to equal participation at the strategic and governance level, DFO does respect First Nations' greater stake in the fisheries. First Nations see this as respectful of their status as rights and title holders, as opposed to user groups such as recreational and commercial fishers. In this way, they're treated as owners, having an interest in the fisheries that goes far deeper than issues of allocation. I want to now turn to 3 practical and cost-efficient benefits of joint management for ensuring better management of the fisheries, as we understand that your recommendations will inevitably be grounded in the conservation of the Fraser River sockeye salmon stocks. First of all, joint management will help to streamline and better structure DFO's consultation activities. If appropriately structured, true joint management will ensure that DFO is consulting with First Nations on policies and fisheries management decisions from the beginning of the policy development process. This is in keeping with their legal obligations. It is important to point out, as other participants have, that Aboriginal rights belong to individual First Nations. This is a fact that must be respected in any proposed joint management structure. Likewise, decisions will need to be made at various levels within the overall management structure. Thus, joint management will not eliminate the need for all bilateral meetings. However, if properly mandated and structured, joint management can ensure consultation at the broad strategic level is conducted in a more orderly and efficient fashion. This is particularly important to note, as it is likely the key motivator for DFO to engage in joint management. Secondly, joint management at a local level addresses the need for on-the-ground support that is not available under DFO's sole management of the fisheries at this time. In our written submissions, we canvass in detail the evidence before this Commission regarding the lack of DFO presence along British Columbia's coastline. With significant impending cuts to DFO's operating budget, further reductions to the amount of DFO staff on the water are clearly foreseeable. Joint management at a local level can assist by empowering First Nations members to fill this vacuum for on-the-ground support of fisheries management activities in a cost-efficient and effective manner. As stated by other participants before us, First Nations provide an invaluable year-round local presence. Ceding First Nations jurisdiction for local management activities also allows for the incorporation of their local knowledge and traditional ecological knowledge into fisheries management. I'd like to take a moment to highlight 3 specific examples set out in our written submissions for how sharing management responsibilities between First Nations and DFO might allow for greater efficiencies in the overall structure. First, we recommend that the Aboriginal Fisheries Guardian Program receives stable long-term funding and standardized training. The Guardians provide an excellent example of how ceding local management to First Nations can create greater efficiencies. They provide cost-effective monitoring and enforcement capacity to coastal and in-river fisheries and can provide a venue for Aboriginal knowledge to be incorporated into these activities. The evidence before you, however, is that they require greater support from DFO in order to fully realize their potential. We also recommend that Healthsick be given the power to make determinations of all openings and closings within their traditional territory, including commercial and recreational. Healthsick's Fisheries Department spends a far more significant time on the water than DFO within their traditional territory, and Healthsick have the best information for making these determinations. Canada's reply is that such an approach would be, quote, obviously problematic, end quotes, due to the complexity of fisheries management, as well as the need to coordinate various fisheries that target migrating stocks. However, Healthsick's evidence in this hearing is that coordination with other First Nations already exists. For example, Healthsick issued a closure on FSC fishing for the passing early Stewart sockeye salmon in 2010. This was in response to a request from Tier 1 working groups overseeing the Fraser River sockeye stocks. Canada cites R.V. Nicol for the principle that the salmon fishery requires control exercised by central authority. However, Nicol should not be read in such a way that the central authority overseeing the salmon fishery cannot be a joint management authority. This is not what the case stands for. We submit that it is obviously problematic for decisions on openings and closings to be made by managers outside the area where these decisions are implemented. Closings and openings must not be made without the benefit of eyes and ears on the fishery itself. Joint management offers the potential for an appropriate balance to be struck between the need for overall coordination of management activities and the incorporation of local information and knowledge into management decisions. We also recommend that DFO support Healthsick in conducting test fishing activities on the Fraser River sockeye salmon within their traditional territory. Our final submissions canvass Healthsick's experience with test fishing activities, as well as their knowledge of the Fraser River sockeye salmon's migration route and the need for in-season management within their waters. Canada's reply to this is that the evidence suggests Healthsick's traditional territory is not optimal for conducting test fishing activities. We wish to note that only Healthsick witnesses have attested to having tangible knowledge of the Fraser River sockeye's migration through these waters. As such, they are the only witnesses to give any meaningful evidence with respect to the suitability of test fishing in this location. Further, we submit that joint management provides more oversight and transparency with respect to DFO decision-making. Many of the submissions before you have focused on the lack of transparency in DFO's current decision-making processes. Concerns have been raised that DFO's current top-down management structure may be particularly susceptible to the influence of industry lobbyists. This is in part because the minister remains the ultimate authority over any of the department's decisions. Likewise, allegations have been made that DFO gives preferential treatment to the aquaculture industry over other stakeholders. And Healthsick, as well as other First Nations, have raised numerous concerns with the lack of transparency with respect to DFO's policies governing Aboriginal fisheries. If a joint management structure is adopted in which First Nations are given equal representation alongside the Crown, many of these concerns would disappear. I'll refer to the oral submissions of Counsel for the Conservation Coalition in this regard. This group of NGOs has expressly recognized the value of joint management in balancing DFO's management objectives against those of First Nations. First Nations worldviews are inherently tied to the long-term sustainability of a fish, as they rely on these fish culturally, socially, as well as economically, and they will continue to rely on the fish for generations. They are inseparable from the land and the water that make up their traditional territories, and in this way, they are inseparable from the fish and their habitat as well. By distributing control over fisheries management through a joint management structure, both First Nations and the public at large can be assured that industry pressure is not compromising the decisions being made by this management body. We also wish to make a few final comments on the topic of aquaculture. Our written submissions set out Healthsick's position in this regard, and we also wish to adopt and endorse the oral submissions given by the Conservation Coalition and the Aquaculture Coalition earlier this week. Furthermore, we note that additional hearings will be held in December of this year on the topic of infectious salmon anemia virus, at which time we'll be able to challenge the unified assertion of Canada, the province, and the BC Salmon Farmers Association that no exotic pathogens have been found in British Columbia's waters. At this time, I'd like to pick up on the submissions of Mr. McDade for the Aquaculture Coalition. Mr. McDade noted that the fish health data produced through this commission has been invaluable in understanding what is actually happening on fish farms in terms of pathogens and disease. Had this commission not taken place, this information would not otherwise have been made available. Mr. McDade also brought you to the limited information that will be made public through DFO's new proposed licensing requirements. HealthSIC wishes to direct your attention to the testimony of Dr. Jones and Dr. Succeeda in paragraphs 111 and 112 of our written final submissions. These witnesses stated that in order to assess the risk of open net pen salmon farms, all competent and interested parties, including First Nations, should have access to a wide range of fish health information, including production data, information on the number of fish stocked, the time of stocking, treatment histories, lice counts, the species of lice, the stage of development of the fish, and the mortalities, as well as environmental information. We recommend that DFO provide this information and more to First Nations for consultation on proposed aquaculture activities. We furthermore recommend that DFO make this level of detailed information available to the public. This level of transparency is absolutely necessary if there is to be any confidence in the sustainability of this form of economic activity. I'd also like to take a moment to highlight our submissions in reply to those of Mr. Kelleher. Now, Mr. Kelleher referred to a document entitled Socioeconomic Benefits of Finfish Aquaculture in BC Aboriginal Communities, which was authored by some unknown person. HealthSIC objected to the admissibility of this document, which purports that First Nations, including HealthSIC, have received employment, skills, leadership, and social benefits from aquaculture in their jurisdictions. Although this document has been admitted into evidence, HealthSIC has had no opportunity to cross-examine its author, who was not called as a witness in these hearings, or to provide evidence to challenge its factual assertions, as no further HealthSIC witness could be called to give evidence. This report was particularly repugnant to HealthSIC, as it wrongfully concluded that First Nations, including HealthSIC, benefited economically, socially, and culturally from the salmon farms on its territory. HealthSIC has a zero-tolerance view of finfish aquaculture in open net pens and is opposed to salmon farms on its territory, and would not agree that it benefits from these farms. We submit that no weight should be given to this report. We also wish to highlight our recommendation that DFO funds additional conservation hatcheries to rebuild sockeye salmon along British Columbia's coast. The Emily Lake Hatchery that is operated by the HealthSIC Nation is an object of great pride in the community. At paragraphs 50 to 52 of our written final submissions, we set out in detail the success that HealthSIC has had in running this inexpensive sockeye hatchery. It is temporary in nature and aimed at rebuilding their local stocks. Operations such as these further the important goals of maintaining a diversity of salmon stocks. This in turn leads to a better distribution of harvesting activities and will also provide greater genetic diversity to weather the uncertainty of climate change. We note that the BC Salmon Farmers Association suggests that hatcheries pose unknown risks for pathogen transfer and criticizes our recommendation on this basis. The Salmon Farmers Association has no evidentiary basis to criticize the fish health procedures adopted by conservation hatcheries such as Emily Lake, nor do we have evidence before this commission to combat this baseless assertion. In closing, I wish to reiterate HealthSIC Elder Harvey Humchit's imperative statement that we need to protect our salmon. We ask that you, Mr. Commissioner, recognize the efforts to date of HealthSIC and other First Nations to do just this, to protect their salmon. We also ask that you give guidance to DFO as to how the conservation activities of First Nations can be better coordinated and supported through a restructuring of their organization. Joint management is not a management experiment, as some council have suggested to you. Rather, joint management is a necessary move forward for DFO. It is necessary not only for reconciliation with Aboriginal peoples, but also, quite importantly, for the sake of the salmon. Thank you. And now I'll turn to Lisa Fong.
But I am the last speaker, and I will be about 16 minutes, so I can proceed, or we can take a break at your pleasure. We'll proceed. Thank you. Mr. Commissioner, the FSC fishery matters to your recommendations because the Fraser salmon are harvested in the FSC fishery. You've heard evidence on some years the FSC fishery has the only harvest of Fraser salmon. This inextricable link necessarily means that any recommendations made as to the management of Fraser salmon will affect the FSC fishery. Now, the FSC fishery is an Aboriginal right. Therefore, your recommendations must account for Aboriginal rights. By accounting for Aboriginal rights, we mean not only those Aboriginal rights which have been proven in courts, but also those asserted Aboriginal rights which have not yet been proven. It would be wrong and short-sighted for this Commission to prejudice those yet to be proven Aboriginal rights. At the heart of DFO's management of the FSC fishery lies the duty to consult. You've heard from Ms. Song on the duty to consult. DFO must consult with First Nations when it contemplates conduct that may adversely affect the Aboriginal right to fish, including any potential right. That was in Haida. DFO must consult with respect to operational decisions, but also with respect to strategic planning for resources, and that was in Haida, and most recently in the case of Rio Tinto, a case of 2010, Supreme Court of Canada. And I say that because Canada criticizes some of us for not naming more recent cases. Helsic's experience with DFO's management of the FSC fishery is that it fails to meet its duty of consultation. And I'm going to spend my time today speaking about 3 examples. And all 3 of these examples have one common theme. And that theme is a lack of transparency. The lack of transparency includes DFO failing to give notice, for example, of policies or frameworks, to DFO failing to disclose relevant information, and to DFO failing to provide reasons for its decisions. Lack of transparency prevents First Nations from being properly consulted and heard, and makes DFO unaccountable. Lack of transparency not only reflects a lack of consultation, but it demonstrates poor governance. Now, some of these participants, and especially Canada and the province, have urged you not to make any rulings of law, and have cautioned you specifically against ruling on Aboriginal rights and consultation. But this does not preclude what Helsic urges you to do, which is to make recommendations that take into account asserted Aboriginal rights. This also does not preclude you from finding that DFO, in fact, manages the FSC fishery without transparency or accountability. So now I move to my first example. The first example of the failure to consult First Nations is DFO's refusal to disclose the endpoint percentage and its system. DFO has already admitted that all FSC and Aboriginal commercial fishing amounts are managed to a total endpoint cumulative allocation, which is a percentage of the total allowable catch. This percentage has been determined by DFO, is currently in use for governing all Aboriginal access to fisheries, including economic opportunity and FSC amounts. The endpoint allocation may adversely affect Aboriginal rights. The amount of fish in the FSC fishery is based on need, which should be determined through consultation. And yet, Ms. McGivney acknowledged in cross-examination that neither the endpoint allocation system nor the adopted percentage itself were the subject of consultation. Canada has refused to disclose the endpoint percentage or its system. In response to a disclosure order by this Commission, Canada claimed cabinet privilege and obtained a certificate under Section 39 of the Evidence Act. Now, there's absolutely no question that the information is privileged. That's what that certificate means. And that was Canada's reply to Helsic's complaint of lack of transparency in its reply submission. But that doesn't detract from the enormity of DFO failing to disclose what is really one of the most important management decisions affecting the Fraser salmon, which is how many Fraser salmon can be harvested for the FSC fishery. Why don't we know that? This also doesn't detract from the enormity of DFO failing to disclose the fact that there was an endpoint allocation or that there was an endpoint allocation system until forced to do so in this Commission. You will remember that disclosure was made in the face of Helsic's application for the production of the coast-wide framework documents, and not as part of the normal course of the production in this Commission. Now, from a transparency perspective, the secrecy of the endpoint allocation means a lack of consultation, as well as a process where neither First Nations nor the general public can access the merits of the allocation, or the allocation process. HealthSIC recommends that Canada disclose the existing endpoint allocation, of course after dealing with the Section 39 certificate, and that furthermore, or if they can't, that Canada go forward using an FSC allocation process to be developed in consultation with First Nations. This takes me to my second example, consultation with HealthSIC on its annual FSC allotments in its Comprehensive Fisheries Agreement. I'll call it the CFA. HealthSIC has 20,000 pieces of sockeye as an FSC allotment in its CFA. FSC allotments, by their very definition, may adversely affect the Aboriginal right to fish and therefore must be consulted upon. This is expressly recognized right in the CFA that there will be a yearly consultation on the allotment, at which time the parties are to review needs and conservation requirements. Chief Newman has testified that the purpose of the consultation on the FSC numbers is to establish HealthSIC's needs. Mr. Wilson, who is the director of HealthSIC Integrated Resource Management Department and who has been a chief counselor of HealthSIC Tribal Council, testified that based on his review of older documents, DFO does not and has not consulted on the number of 20,000 pieces of sockeye or advised of a basis for that number. Likewise, Chief Newman, who has been chief counselor and member of the HealthSIC Tribal Council, testified that he could not ever recall an increase in the 20,000 sockeye pieces or HealthSIC being consulted on the FSC numbers in its CFA. His recollection is that DFO simply set out the FSC number for HealthSIC's signature. And notably, Canada, in its reply submission, remains silent about this evidence. Rather, Canada proceeds in its reply submission to state that in determining allocations for FSC purposes, DFO will consider a number of factors in consultation with First Nations in question, and goes on to set out these factors. Now, this apparent transparency, because I suggest that's what that argument's about, is belied by the footnoted policy. Go right to the document. You can look at the document. It's a 1993 policy for the Quebec region, and the link doesn't work to the site. So it's not even posted right now. The other footnoted document is correspondence from DFO to Commission Counsel Ms. Chan. I mean, obviously, neither of these documents could constitute disclosure for the purposes of consultation. And I come back to what Ms. Song says. It's not consultation to create a maze of documents and say, oh, you know what, you could have looked at them on the website, or they were available in that dusty shelf in that old library over there. That's not enough. Finally, there's been absolutely no evidence of consultation of these factors that determine the FSC allocation. So from a transparency perspective, DFO's FSC allocation process is opaque. DFO has not provided HealthSIC with information on its allocation process, has in fact failed to apply any allocation process to ensure that HealthSIC's FSC allocations continue to meet their needs. We obviously recommend a transparent and needs-based consultative approach to determining FSC allocations. And now that takes me to my third example, DFO's failure to consult with HealthSIC on its FSC needs in season. HealthSIC lacks in-season management of Fraser salmon swimming through its territorial waters in the Central Coast. As a result, in 2010, HealthSIC was unaware of the strength of the run that year until after the fish had left HealthSIC waters and were counted in Johnston Strait. In seeking to have FSC fished by another First Nation, HealthSIC found itself informed by DFO officers, first by Kristen Wong, then by Greg Thomas, and then by Randy Braniak, that FSC could only be caught within HealthSIC's management area, and that FSC caught elsewhere would have come off the host nation's FSC allocation. A rule that Mr. Wilson testified DFO never disclosed to HealthSIC at the time they entered the agreements or otherwise. Indeed, Mr. Wilson later spoke to 3 other First Nations, with one understanding a nation-to-nation agreement would result in the catch numbers coming off the requesting nation's allocation, so the opposite. Mr. Wilson then asked for an accommodation. DFO gave various remarkable responses. DFO said it did not consider Northern First Nations to have access to Fraser River sockeye salmon, and yet HealthSIC CFA provides for sockeye expressly. DFO said Health-Six allocations of fishing areas were set. DFO was working under treaty guidelines and policies and had no option. And yet the Northern IFMP, paragraph 5.3, expressly provides for amendments in season for increase in FSC. And again, DFO also said that the marine area First Nations were limited to a total of 260,000 Fraser salmon. And again, the IFMP North expressly provides a system for an amendment to increase FSC in season. The facts illustrate a management rule that DFO did not develop in consultation with First Nations or disclose in advance to First Nations. Canada submits, in its various responses, first, that the factual record's incomplete because the Commission didn't present DFO witnesses with direct knowledge on this particular incident. But Canada really is the least favorable position to argue a lack of opportunity to present witnesses. In its own submissions, it admits that 80% of the witnesses that were called in this hearing were DFO witnesses. It says it produced, and I believe them, over 500,000 documents. And we all know Canada was given the lion's share of time to conduct direct and cross-examination of witnesses and to make submissions. And we're not being critical of that whatsoever because, of course, this is a commission about their management, and that's appropriate. But Canada has had a full opportunity to cross-examine the Health-Six witnesses, which it didn't on this issue. They could have adduced relevant documents, and they could have adduced testimony through one of their many witnesses, including Mr. Rosenberger, who could have informed himself by speaking to his subordinates, Mr. Thomas and Mr. Braniak. It's not reasonable for Canada to now say, in reply, it didn't have the opportunity to present rebuttal evidence. Canada also now argues an interpretation of the terms of the Comprehensive Fisheries Agreement that prevents fishing out of the area without DFO authorization and says, Health-Six, you ought to have known better. Why do you complain? But Canada failed to raise these points with Health-Six witnesses in cross-examination. If Canada had done so, the witnesses might have testified as to their interpretation of those agreement terms. They might have testified about why they think their Aboriginal rights are not limited by the CFA. They might have talked about how it was their view that nation-nation agreements are outside of the DFO purview. Again, it's not open to Canada, and it's unreasonable for them to now say, we should hold them to those terms without cross-examination. It's like impeachment without taking the issue up with the witness. As an answer to Health-Six submission that DFO did not disclose a management rule that any FSC caught elsewhere would have come off a host nation's FSC allocation, Canada implies that the management rule has actually been in place since 1993, and it was on a website, and we should have known about it. But it's a 1993 policy, and it's the same one I'm speaking of. It says it's from the Quebec region. It's not readily available. We tried the URL, and it only refers to an Aboriginal fishing authority treating an Aboriginal individual seeking to fish in areas not of its own. It does not refer to agreements between First Nations, and furthermore, there was no evidence that this policy, this 1993 policy from the Quebec region, was in place when Health-Six sought to fish outside of its management area in 2010. And there was no cross-examination on it. It wasn't even a document that was presented during that part of the hearing. Even Mr. Huber, a very senior DFO employee, testified on June 30th, 2011, that he didn't know DFO's policy on allocation between First Nations fishing out of the management areas, even though he sits on the current FSC task force. And finally, Canada now asserts that past concerns about FSC allocations being inadequate and inequitable and applied without analytic or administrative framework have now been addressed by DFO, implementing in consultation with First Nations a comprehensive evaluation operational framework. That's in their reply, paragraph 290. And yet, if you look at the fine print in the footnote, yet Canada only refers to documents marked draft and which were not disclosed to First Nations, being stamped protected for negotiation. And we know what that means because Health-Six in particular had to deal with that issue. The evidence does not disclose any comprehensive evaluation and operational FSC framework implemented in consultation with First Nations. It might have been the case that the information from our place at the table was used to develop these draft evaluations and operational frameworks, but that doesn't mean these drafts or their final versions, if they exist, were made in consultation with First Nations. Not surprisingly, HealthSAC's recommendation here is for proper consultation on in-season management of FSC. Proper consultation requires transparency, including DFO's FSC policies, operations, and frameworks. Now, interestingly, through all this, given the evidence and the positions of Canada and First Nations in this commission, DFO's failure to consult on FSC might be best addressed by DFO agreeing to a strong model of joint management where First Nations will manage their own FSC allocations. There's been ample evidence from Mr. Wilson that the 4 nations on the Central Coast are collaborative and well-functioning. You've heard evidence about the 4 nations forming the Central Coast Indigenous Resource Alliance supporting marine use planning. You've also heard evidence about them forming the Central Coast Commercial Fishing Association developing business plan for pick fee licenses. And most recently, the crowning achievement, they've achieved Tier 1 completion of their marine use plan under PNSEMA. HealthSAC's recommendation is that this commission promote a strong model of joint management where First Nations are at the decision-making table with full information, 50-50 representation, and have management of their own FSC allocation. We think this would benefit everybody and would be very efficient. We want to do our round of thank yous. And so first we want to thank the participants themselves for applying to provide information and share information with this commission. We want to thank heartily their counsel, especially those who have come through snow and rain on a daily basis and put in all this good and hard work, on short time frames, and often you're living off cookies at night. And our team in particular wants to thank the FNC team. We recognize that they were here every single day of hearing, and without them, First Nations would not have been able to cover all the issues in this very large hearing. We want to thank the staff of the Commission for being able to organize this mammoth operation and doing incredible magical things with documents and screens and herding all of us along. And we want to thank the Commission Council for their great and hard work and all those fabulous PPRs and the reports, and also, just for herding us along during the hearing, which I know at times was not so easy. And of course, first and foremost, we wish to thank Mr. Commissioner for taking on this incredibly daunting task, many would not have, for showing the obvious commitment to this work and carrying it out so wonderfully, and at all times being generous and kind and super efficient. Thank you very much. Those are our submissions.
I always like to wait a minute or so to make sure that is the last word. I'm learning. I'm a slow learner, but I'm learning. You've all been most gracious to those of us sitting up here. This room didn't provide the same logistics that we had in courtroom 801, so I've agreed to have Commission Counsel sit up here so we had enough seats out there for participants and their counsel. And so you've been directing all of your comments up here, and we've heard them, and we're all very taken aback, frankly, by the gracious way you've expressed your views, and I thank you for that. I do want to thank the participants and their counsel for your participation in this Commission of Inquiry. I can easily say, without your constant willingness to find compromise and seek cooperation amongst each other, and the extent of your courtesy and professionalism displayed throughout the hearings and the entire process, the Commission could not have done its important work. I also want to say your dedication and very hard work, which was evident here, is clearly reflected in your written and oral submissions. I have found your submissions most thoughtful and helpful to me in the process of understanding your respective positions, as I ultimately must do in carrying out my duties as set out in the terms of reference. You have served your groups and clients, as well as the salmon, with a deep sense of commitment to this process, and on behalf of the Commission staff and myself, you deserve our mutual gratitude. I also wish to express a deep appreciation to the entire Commission staff. In carrying out your role as participants, you have come to know and work with most of the Commission staff. You have seen, and in fact, you have mentioned in your remarks here this week, their dedication to the work when you have met with them over document production or witness interviews, staff and participant meetings, and in these hearings. I have had the distinct privilege of working on an almost daily basis with this outstanding team of women and men who have given me their unstinting support throughout the process, and they have displayed a deep and abiding interest in the subject matter of this inquiry. They are fully committed to the goal of the Commission in producing a report which will contain a thorough review and consideration of the evidence and the participants' positions on the evidence. Finally, as far as thank yous go, I want to thank those, and you've mentioned them as well, who have worked in the hearing rooms and behind the scenes to translate and record the evidence, to manage the exhibits and the documents, and to operate the technology, which has been so fundamental to our process. Without their assistance, we simply could not have run the hearings. They have performed a most valued contribution to the process. And I'm also grateful to the Federal Court in this building and the BC Securities Commission, where we're now reposed, who've allowed us to use their facilities and have shown us great hospitality. Some of you sitting in this room today, and some who are not here today, I have known and respected for years as highly skilled and competent counsel. Others, including some non-lawyer spokespersons in this process, I have come to know and respect through your participation in this process. I am indebted, truly indebted to all of you for your hard work, for your diligence, and for your many contributions. It has been truly an honor for me to serve in this position. I shall never forget all of you and the passion that you've each shown for the work we are all engaged in and for the goals and objectives expressed in the terms of reference. I understand we have a couple of more days to go with respect to hearings, and that will unfold in due course. But in the meantime, I wish each and every one of you good health, much happiness, much success, and that you may all come to realize what an important contribution you've made. Thank you very much. We are adjourned.